Welcome back to the American Tradition, everyone. My name is Jeremy Mack. I am a pastor, I am a farmer, I'm a localist, and I'm an essayist. And I'm coming back to talk to you again today about instability. Today, we're going to talk about political instability. Remind you already, we've talked about in a previous video, we started out with moral instability, and we talked about how a change from a Christian civilization really happened around 1930. And from 1930 on, I think we could pretty much say that's when modernity begins. And from 1930 on, America has been an atheistic society. It's been a materialistic society. In other words, it only sought to live in the here and the now. And so since there was no eternity, this was all there is. So the idea now is to follow our heart, to satiate all the desires that we can possibly have. And it's not to deny ourselves. So we became atheistic, materialistic, and then we also became consumeristic. So, and consumerism is when we have the capacity through the Industrial Revolution to create the tools and the toys to satiate all our desires. So we have now what's called a secular religion. Those three things that I just listed, atheism, materialism, and consumerization, those are the three dogmas then of the new secular society. And the new secular society then began to be based on satiating your desires. And so where before our economic system was on self-denial, and so it was based on savings, you saved your money, and where it was also based on a stronger currency. We had a currency that couldn't just be printed at will. And so we not only saved our currencies or saved our money, but we also maintained its value over time. And what we did was we saved to invest in infrastructure, and we saved to invest in our lives, and we saved and we bought things, and we held actual assets that were not encumbered by debt. And so, but now in the modern era, what we began to do is we began, instead of being a savings society, we began to be a spending society, a society that spent money. This led to massive growth in personal debt, massive growth in family debt, and massive growth in state debt, meaning like the state that you live in, and then also massive growth in your city, like the city you live in, and massive debt growth in the US federal government. So our system became riddled up and down with debt. And what happened was, if you remember from that previous video, was it created economic instability by creating disparity. So if you were in the middle or the lower classes, especially if you were in the poor class, you felt that money printing, and you felt the interest rates on the debt a lot more. And so you feel trapped, and you feel like you can't make ends meet, and it feels hopeless. And this economic disparity builds up, and then the politics erupts out of that, because what you have is a popular disparity, because politics is really the popular opinions toward each other, or in popular opinions about how we collectively solve problems together. So what happened is that these people that felt trapped in the lower classes through economic disparity, right? The gap between the rich and the poor grows bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's because the wealthy actually benefit from low interest rates, and the wealthy actually benefit from money printing because they're the first to receive the benefits from it. And then they're poor because they don't have capacities to take out loans, and they don't have access to sort of financial instruments. They're the ones that their money's eroded out, but there's no benefit for them. So one of the things I'll point out, and this is not meant to be another economic video, but just the price of housing, right? So we create a wealth effect. And so if you own a house, your wealth is increasing. If you don't own a house, your wealth is decreasing. But it's money printing that drives the cost of houses up, okay? So it's money printing that drives the cost of those houses up, and allows folks to really grow their wealth really just by home ownership. And that's called the wealth effect. But there's a lot of people who don't benefit from that at all. And so those are the poorest. And so what you have is you have an economic disparity that opens up. And as the prices go higher and higher, fewer and fewer people are able to own houses. And then you end up with a nation of renters, which is why low interest rates and low down payments hasn't actually benefited the society broadly. Like there's not a greater percentage of people that own houses now, and the reason is because like it's supply and demand, right? When you give more people access to loans, that you increase the demand, well, it increased the price, because high demand increases the price of it, and the higher prices increase, the fewer people in our society can afford them. So over time, what you've created is you've created a class of people that can own houses and a class of people who can't. The class of people who can don't own any assets. And the difference between rich people and poor people is rich people own assets and poor people don't. Okay. And the more those asset prices go higher, the richer the wealthy get. And the more those asset prices go higher, the poorer the poor get, because rents go up, right? And other costs associated with that. So that's economic disparity. That's the way that works. That's what happens. And it's government policies, right? It's a government artificially lowering rates. It's a government artificially printing. It's a government who has a currency that doesn't have any actual value and doesn't hold value. And it's the poor who feel that, but somebody has to be blamed. All right. And so what you have is you have politicians then come around, and then it's not always just politicians. People just look over there and it's the man, right? And that guy's keeping me down, or this lady's keeping me down, or those people are stealing rightfully what's ours. And, and there ends up being a popular disagreement between the poor and the rich. And then we actually had, on top of that, we layered a culture war on top of that now. So there used to be just the poor, the middle class, and the wealthy, but now there's the poor white, all right, who have privilege, and then there's the poor black who don't have privilege, or the poor Hispanic who don't have privilege. So even poor whites have privilege. And so there even has created now a hierarchy within poverty, and a hierarchy within the middle class, and a hierarchy within the wealthy even, so that, like Oprah Winfrey can lecture us now, a billionaire can lecture us on income inequality. She doesn't know anything about income inequality, or at least she has not for a long time. I know Oprah one time didn't have any money, so let's not say she doesn't know anything. But at this point in time, she's lived well so long, I'm sure it's very difficult to remember what it was really like and what a common person's life is really like. But these hierarchies within the classes also create a culture war. So you have a class war and a culture war. And this has created really a serious problem in the United States. All right. So you have a difference in class and a difference in culture. But you've had political instability for a while because there's really two Americas. And I don't mean there's two Americas, rich and poor now. I mean, there's two Americas. All right. So there are people who have a leftover vestige, whether they're Christians or not, of sort of like self-sufficiency and self-discipline and not satiating your passions and desires. And these would be conservatives. So a conservative thinks whether or not he or she's a Christian or not, they still have these vestiges of personal responsibility and things like that. Okay. And then there's another side of that where basically says, no. What we need to do is satiate more of our desires, and we need to print more money, and we need to do free college, and we need to do free healthcare, and we need to do free everything. And what we just need to do is the government can print enough money, and we can just go into debt all we want, and we just need to satiate more and more and more desires. Eventually, we'll solve all our societal and all our cultural problems. So you have two vastly different views in the United States. And I know that there are ranges, right? So there's your average Democrat. So let's use Chuck Schumer as an average Democrat. But then there's also, Kamala Harris or Bernie Sanders, or there's Ocasio-Cortez, right? So, and why do I bring them up? Because there's a big degree difference between some of those people. We might not say Chuck Schumer is a communist, but we can pretty much say Bernie Sanders is a communist. He took his honeymoon in the Soviet Union. Okay. Ocasio-Cortez, she's left of him. She's a hardcore Marxist. And Kamala Harris, our elect, our vice president elect, is Her voting record is the most liberal actually in the Senate. So there's a degree, but there's also degrees on the right. And so there's country club Republicans like the Bushes, who are sort of, well, let's cut tax and that'll boost aggregate demand. But then there are other people on the right, like libertarians who believe, almost in no government, well, some libertarians believe in no government, so the anarcho-capitalists. So on the right, you have, degrees, and on the left, you have degrees. Now, in other countries that have parliamentarian systems, what happens when you get this sort of fragmentation in society because of economic instability is you end up with 6 or 8 movements within your nation. But in a parliamentarian system, you work on percentages of elections, and then you have to cobble together ruling governments that may actually have people that disagree with one another. So like Italy is a good case in point, where they actually had, they had a cobbled together government of people that really didn't agree on very much, but they had to put some type of compromise government together. So in a parliamentarian system actually can foster a little bit better societal sort of unity when you have this breakdown in society. But in our system's a two-party system. No matter where you fall on the left, you're on the left. No matter where you fall on the right, you're on the right. And so while like somebody like me who's a small government guy, I didn't like George W. Bush much more than I liked President Obama, which means I didn't really like them at all personally. It's not a color thing, and it's not a class thing. I just disagree with their fundamental policies, both of them, almost equally. But still, people would lump me and George W. Bush in the same camp, even though we have almost nothing in common. And so that's what happens. You end up with a bifurcated system, okay? And this bifurcated system pits half the population against the other half of the population. And that's exactly what you have right now. And you can see that going back to, say, 2000 with the Bush-Gore election, and how closely divided we were as a country, and how difficult it was to come to any agreement. And then, in the last election as well, you can see that there were huge issues in the Trump election. Even now, we have a very close election, and some of these races were settled. They're not even settled yet, but some of these races were settled by a few thousand votes. Georgia 10,000. I think Nevada was in like 12,000, 15,000. I don't know the exact numbers, but we have a very tightly contested government. And so now we have a great political instability. I'll give you an example of this, okay? So first of all, there's some what I would call yo-yo activity going on in the government. So Bill Clinton takes over in 1996, so he wins his second term, and then he uses the Internal Revenue Service to harass churches out west. I mean, they locked the doors on churches for Internal Revenue Service violations because they stood against him. Nixon did the same thing against the Democrats in the early 70s. Then President Obama in 2010, the Tea Party comes to power, and President Obama uses, everybody, well, you may not remember it, but Lois Lerner and the Internal Revenue Service hold up a bunch of 501c classifications over Tea Party. And so they just put them in a file and just decide not to move on them. So they begin to use government entities to punish their political rivals. And then you go from, so a President Obama to a President Trump. That's a swift change. So that's a swift change in governing philosophies. And even at the time, we thought in like 2000, it felt like a big change between Bill Clinton and George W. Bush. It really wasn't, though. So, George W. Bush just turned out to be not very conservative. He would talk about compassionate conservatism, which was just big government spending. That's all that was. It was an increase in almost nobody increased the warfare state and the welfare state like George W. Bush. So anyway, you end up with political instability, and that political instability shows up in only two parties, and those two parties then are at odds with each other. And then you start to have yo-yo like policy changes between, say, a President Obama to a President Trump. Now it looks like back to a President Biden, and who knows what'll happen in 2024. if we won't get somebody, along the Trump line again, because we know that this government is or this nation is closely divided, and there's a few people who change sides in different elections and go with one party to another, and so you end up with things like, okay, are we a tariffing nation or are we a free trade nation? Are we going to be part of the Paris Climate Accords? Are we not going to be part of the Paris Climate Accords? Can we make a treaty with Iran, or can we not make a treaty with Iran? Can we bring our troops home from abroad, or and stop being a policeman of the world, or are we continuing to be the policeman of the world? I mean, you're seeing these things right now are kind of playing out in the transition between a President Trump to a President Biden. So when we look at these things, this creates instability politically. And it not just, and this is where I want to take our next video, it doesn't just affect us, because it affects our standing on the world stage, because we are the world reserve currency and we are the policemen of the world. We are the protectors generally of the West. And so it affects our relationships with the EU and Brussels. It affects our relationships with China. I am very much, I don't really care personally what China thinks about what we do. I'm just saying that in the world stage, where we are the reserve currency in the world, where if you're another nation, you have to change your currency out into our currency in order to buy, raw natural resources or oil, which is a big thing. It's petrodollar, where you have to exchange your currency into a dollar in order to buy oil from, say, Saudi Arabia or the OPEC nation. So if you're one of these nations in the world and you're looking around and you don't know whether or not we're going to be pro-trade or not pro-trade, pro-business or not pro-business, whether or not we're going to be high tax on corporate structures or low tax on corporate structures, whether or not we're going to be friendly to importers or not friendly to importers, or whether or not our money is going to continue to erode away, or whether or not we're going to get our spending under control. I mean, if you're one of these nations in the world on the world stage, or if you're a group, which is really more important, if you're a group of these nations on the world stage, you might be trying to hatch a plan to get out from under a nation that's supposed to be the world leader, but who's now descended into massive instability. So you can see the original point of my videos was to show how our moral instability led to an economic instability, which has now led to a political instability. But those three types of instability, eventually, maybe not tomorrow, but maybe sooner than you all think, could end with us not being the world leader anymore. And there are organizations out there, like I've done videos about the Great Reset. There are organizations out there like the World Economic Forum, and the World Economic Forum is committed to the U.S. not being the world leader. You should look at their material. And the global stage is pretty committed to us no longer being the world leader, and to us being a part of a group of world leaders. And any change, especially, and I'll say this to you, and this is very important, especially in the economic realm, especially on the reserve currency. Because see, what allows the US to print money the way that we do is because these other nations have to hold US dollars in their banks abroad, because they need those dollars to exchange in their currency so that they can buy things on the world market, like oil, for instance, which almost all of the developed nations need. So what will happen is, if the world reserve currency changes from the US to a basket of currencies, or even to, let's say we break up to a multipolar world where the US is one pole, and let's say China is the Asian pole, and let's say maybe Germany is the European pole, or because Germany dominates the EU, they're the most productive nation. They benefit the most from a European Union, and let's say Germany dominates Europe, and so we end up with a tripolar sort of lineup where you can buy oil or natural resources in any of the three currencies, maybe the dollar, the euro, or the yuan. Well, that means 2/3 of those currencies, of the dollars that we have in foreign banks overseas, they're not going to be needed in those banks overseas. Where are they going to go? They're not going to disappear. They're going to come crashing back into the US. And when they come crashing back into the US, that's hyperinflation. That's when prices go up uncontrollably. That's when prices go up all overnight. And so when you think about the world reserve currency, you may not understand the effect of money printing and the effect of the way of having this debt-based economy and what it could lead to, what it likely will lead to. And so that's sort of the thing that we're looking at. And that's why these three particular instabilities, the moral, economic, and political, cause our standing on the world stage to be questioned. And we've entered into a time where I would say we're a low trust society. You know, do you have confidence that the election that we just settled in 2020 was a free and fair election? I don't. And I know that 75% of likely voting Republicans don't either, and 3%. I think I saw it's a Vox poll. I'll put it in the show notes of this. Like 43% of likely voters in the U.S. believe that Joe Biden benefited from voting fraud. That's a large segment of the population. It's a very large segment of the population. That's a low trust society. Low trust society are places like Cuba, where your vote doesn't matter, so you're not even sure you're going to go vote. Or in Venezuela, where your vote doesn't matter, so you're not even going to go vote. Or in Russia, you know, or in China, where if you vote for the wrong person, you might be tracked down in the social credit system there and not allowed to purchase things or travel certain places. So I'm not saying that the US is Cuba or Venezuela or China or Russia yet, but I am saying that we've crossed a threshold, and now they're even worried about Georgia, whether or not you're going to get a conservative turnout in the state of Georgia in these two runoff races because of a loss of confidence that the election there in Georgia will be free and fair. All right, that's a low confidence system. And once you cross that line, it's very difficult to go back across to a high confidence system. As a kid, no one ever questioned whether a U.S. election was free or fair. Never. I've never seen it happen. This is a major line in the sand that we just stepped over. And so that's why I have this picture behind me, because these three types of instability can cause us to lose our standing on the world stage and cause the world to begin to think about how they can solve their problems differently than with us as a world leader. And that will cause things to massively change in the US. And here's how you'll know, I'll close the video with, here's how you know that we have come to the point where the jig is up. If you ever hear politicians begin to put forward actual cuts in budget, reductions of rate of spending, not just reductions in the rate of increased spending, then you'll know that the jig is up, because the reason they will do that is because they can no longer print their way out of the problem. And they'll have to start looking for things to cut in order to keep those Social Security checks to cashing, or in order to keep the food stamp system functioning, right? Or in order to keep the military in bullets, right? They'll have to start taking from one area of government to give to another area of government, and then they'll have to start ranking things in priority, and you'll see them start having to cut departments. That's called austerity. So this is how you'll know that the world reserve currency has shifted, and we've gone to a multipolar world, or a tripolar world, or some other type of world that we currently live in fiscally. And that's when the U.S. starts talking about austerity, where we have to cut, where we have to reduce our rate of debt, where we have to start increasing our interest rates, where we can no longer do what we're doing internally because of our standing in the world has shifted. And those instabilities will cause that. We are not an exception to the rule. You cannot live contrary to the laws that God has established in humanity, be they moral laws, economic laws, and then there are even fixed political laws that are the way the Christian faith works its way out in a political realm as well. That if you violate those, you'll have a lot of disparity and disagreement. All right, so the next one, I'm going to make some suggestions on how we can overcome our instabilities and where we need to start. So thank you. This is Jeremy Mack from the American Tradition, signing off.